The blood on her dress told the town everything they needed to know, and none of it was the truth. Fiona Riley stumbled into Colfax, New Mexico territory, on a scorching afternoon in August of 1878, her traveling dress torn at the hem and stained crimson across the bodice. Her dark hair had fallen from its pins, hanging in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her face bore the dust of at least 2 days on the road. She'd walked the last 5 miles after her horse went lame, leading the limping animal behind her until she couldn't bear its suffering anymore and let it loose near a creek with good grass. The main street of Colfax stretched before her like a gauntlet she'd have to run. False-fronted buildings lined both sides of the dusty thoroughfare, their painted signs advertising the usual offerings of a mining town: saloon, general store, land office, hotel. Men in work clothes and women in calico dresses stopped their afternoon business to stare at her. Fiona kept her chin up despite the trembling in her legs. She made for the hotel first, a 2-story structure with a covered porch. Her remaining money, sewn into the lining of her bag, would cover a room for at least a week if she was careful. The hotel keeper, a portly man with mutton chops and suspicious eyes, looked her up and down when she entered the lobby. "I need a room," Fiona said, setting her bag on the counter with more force than necessary. "We don't rent to women traveling alone," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I can pay in advance. Don't matter, this is a respectable establishment, I'm respectable." His gaze dropped pointedly to the bloodstains. "That right, where's your husband? I don't have one. Family, also absent." Fiona pulled out her coin purse. "I have money. I'm asking for a room, not charity." The hotel keeper crossed his arms. "Answer's no. Try the boarding house on 5th Street." But the boarding house, run by a pinch-faced woman named Mrs. Hawthorne, proved no more welcoming. She opened the door, took one look at Fiona's disheveled state, and started closing it again. "Please," Fiona said, putting her hand against the door. "I just need somewhere to sleep. I don't take in trouble, and you've got it written all over you. There's a church on the corner. Try the minister." The minister's wife answered Fiona's knock, a baby on her hip and flour on her apron. Her expression shifted from curious to cold in the space of a heartbeat. "I'm looking for somewhere to stay," Fiona began. "The hotel is full up," the woman said quickly. "I already tried there. And the boarding house. Please, I can work. I can cook, clean, mend. We don't need help." The door shut firmly, and Fiona heard the bolt slide home. She stood on the church steps as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. 3 other establishments turned her away in quick succession. The saloon keeper wouldn't even speak to her, just pointed at the door until she left. The owner of the general store said his wife wouldn't stand for taking in a strange woman. Even the livery stable owner, who seemed the most sympathetic, said he couldn't risk his reputation. "Folks talk in a town this size," he'd explained, genuinely apologetic. "You understand." Fiona did understand. She understood that blood on a woman's dress meant scandal, meant violence, meant stories that respectable people didn't want attached to their businesses. It didn't matter that the blood wasn't from anything shameful. It didn't matter that she'd gotten it trying to help a woman who'd been thrown from a stagecoach 3 days back, holding her while she died because there was nothing else to be done. The woman had bled out in Fiona's arms, miles from anywhere, and there'd been no way to clean the dress properly with just canteen water and a handkerchief. As twilight deepened to dusk, Fiona found herself on the outskirts of town, where the buildings gave way to scattered homesteads. Her feet ached, her head pounded, and the thought of spending the night in the open made her want to weep. She hadn't cried when her father died last year, leaving her alone in Philadelphia. She hadn't cried when her aunt's letter arrived, cold and formal, explaining that there was no room for her in their Santa Fe household. She hadn't cried through the long journey west or the endless string of temporary jobs that kept her fed but never quite stable. But now, exhausted and rejected by an entire town, she felt the tears threatening. That's when she saw the house set back from the road, lamplight glowing warm in its windows. It was a simple structure, well-maintained with a covered porch and a small barn out back. Smoke curled from the chimney even in the summer heat, which meant someone was cooking. Fiona's stomach clenched with hunger. She almost kept walking. Pride warred with desperation, and for a long moment, pride was winning. Then she thought about spending the night under the stars with no food, no water, and no safety, and desperation claimed victory. Her knock on the door sounded too loud in the quiet evening. The man who opened it stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of someone who worked hard for a living. He looked to be in his middle 20s, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of summer grass. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and he held a dish towel in one hand. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Fiona opened her mouth to give the speech she'd prepared, the one about being willing to work and causing no trouble, but what came out was, "I need somewhere to stay. Just for tonight. The town won't have me." He looked at her for a long moment, taking in her appearance without the judgment she'd seen all afternoon. His gaze was assessing but not unkind, noting the exhaustion in her face, the state of her clothes, the bag she held like a lifeline. "You hurt?" he asked. "No, the blood isn't mine." "You hurt someone else?" "No, I helped a dying woman. There was a stagecoach accident." He nodded slowly as if this made perfect sense. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." Fiona stared at him. "Just like that, you need shelter." "I've got shelter. Seems simple enough." He gestured into the house. "Name's Nathan Dalton. Folks call me Nate. Fiona Riley." She stepped across the threshold, half expecting him to change his mind, but he just closed the door behind her and hung the dish towel on a hook. The interior of the house was neat and sparse, furnished with handmade furniture that showed skill in its construction. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cook stove beside it. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and she could see a bed through an open doorway to what must be the only bedroom. The smell of something savory made her mouth water. "You eaten?" Nate asked. "Not since yesterday." He moved to the stove without another word, ladling stew into a bowl. "Sit down before you fall down." Fiona sank into one of the chairs, watching him with wary confusion. "Why are you helping me? Why wouldn't I?" He set the bowl in front of her along with a spoon and a hunk of bread. Everyone else in Colfax had plenty of reasons. Colfax is full of folks more concerned with appearances than doing right. He poured coffee into a tin cup. "Eat. We can talk after." The stew was simple, venison and vegetables, but it tasted like the finest meal she'd ever had. Fiona forced herself to eat slowly, even though she wanted to devour it. Nate settled into the other chair with his own bowl, eating in comfortable silence. When she'd scraped the bowl clean and drunk the coffee, Fiona felt almost human again. "Thank you. You're welcome." He collected the dishes and took them to a wash basin. "The bed's yours tonight. I'll take the floor." "I can't ask you to do that." "You didn't ask. I'm offering." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "There's a screen you can change behind if you've got something clean to put on. Well's out back if you want to wash up." "Mr. Dalton, I don't understand. You don't know me. I could be anyone." He turned to face her fully, leaning against the counter. "Could be, but I figure someone who'd hold a dying stranger has a good heart, blood on her dress or not." And I was taught that turning away someone in need is about the worst thing a person can do." He crossed his arms. "My door's open without question because that's how my mother raised me. She'd have taken you in the same way." "Where is she now?" "Died 4 years back. Fever." He said it matter-of-factly, but Fiona heard the old grief underneath. "Pa went 2 years before that, kicked by a horse. I'm sorry. Life out here is hard, you learn that quick." He moved toward the door. "I'll give you some privacy. Holler when you're settled and I'll bring in my bedroll." Alone in the house, Fiona felt the full weight of the day crash down on her. She found her cleanest dress in her bag, though it was wrinkled from travel, and went out to the well. The water was shockingly cold and wonderfully clean. She washed her face and arms, scrubbed at her hands until the last traces of the dead woman's blood were gone, and changed into the fresh dress. The ruined traveling dress she folded carefully. Maybe she could clean it, eventually. Waste not. When she called out that she was ready, Nate returned with a bedroll and a pillow. He made up a sleeping spot near the fireplace with economical movements, clearly accustomed to camping. "Bolt the door after I go out to check the animals," he said. "Don't open it for anyone but me." "You're leaving?" "Just to the barn. Got a horse and some chickens that need tending." He pulled on a hat that had been hanging by the door. "Won't be more than 20 minutes. After he left, Fiona did bolt the door, then sank onto the edge of the bed. It had a real mattress, stuffed with straw and topped with a quilt in a wedding ring pattern. She ran her hand over the stitching, wondering if his mother had made it. She should have been more frightened, staying in a strange man's house. But something about Nathan Dalton felt safe. He'd looked at her with concern rather than suspicion, offered food and shelter without demanding explanations or payment. In a day full of closed doors and hard faces, his kindness stood out like a candle in the dark. When he knocked and identified himself, she unbolted the door. He came in smelling of hay and horse, carrying a basket of eggs. "These are from this morning. Forgot to bring them in earlier." He set them on the counter. "You can have some for breakfast if you want." "How long can I stay?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended. Nate hung his hat back up and looked at her thoughtfully. "Long as you need, I suppose. What are your plans?" "I was heading to Santa Fe. My aunt lives there, but my money's running low and I need to work for a while before I can afford the stage fare." "What kind of work do you do?" "Whatever needs doing. I can cook, clean, sew, keep accounts, teach children their letters. I worked in a dress shop in Philadelphia for a while." She lifted her chin. "I'm a hard worker, Mr. Dalton. I pay my way. Call me Nate." He pulled off his boots and set them by the door. "And I believe you. But finding work in Colfax might be hard if folks have already made up their minds about you." The truth of that settled like a stone in her stomach. "I'll figure something out." "I'm sure you will." He moved to his bedroll and sat down to pull off his socks. "For now, get some sleep. You look about ready to drop." Fiona retreated to the bedroom, closing the door most of the way. She lay down on the bed, still wearing her dress, unsure if fully undressing would be appropriate. The pillow was soft under her head, and the quilt smelled like sage and sunshine. Through the gap in the door, she could see Nate settling into his bedroll, his back to her room, giving her privacy even in the small space. She tried to stay awake, some ingrained caution telling her she should keep watch. But exhaustion pulled her under like a wave, and she slept harder than she had in months. Morning came with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Fiona woke disoriented, sunlight streaming through the window, the sounds of someone moving around the main room. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, and then it all came back. The journey, the rejection, Nathan Dalton's unexpected kindness. She rose and tidied herself as best she could, finger combing her hair and pinning it up. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Nate at the stove, cooking breakfast with the ease of long practice. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Hope you like bacon and eggs." "I like anything I don't have to catch myself." She moved to the table. "Can I help?" "Already done. Sit." He served up plates of food that would have fed a working man, and Fiona realized she was hungry enough to eat every bite. They ate in the same comfortable silence as the night before, and she found herself stealing glances at him. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly. He had a strong jaw with a day's worth of stubble, a straight nose that looked like it might have been broken once, and those remarkable green eyes. His hands were calloused and scarred from work, but he handled the dishes and utensils with surprising gentleness. He wore simple clothes, a work shirt and canvas pants, nothing fancy, but they were clean and well mended. "What do you do?" she asked. "For a living, I mean." "I've got 40 acres about a mile from here. Run some cattle, grow what I can. Mostly I work for the bigger ranches when they need extra hands. Pays enough." He soaked up egg yolk with a piece of bread. "It's a simple life, but it's mine." "Do you live here alone?" "Since Ma died, yeah. Had a brother, but he headed to California 5 years back. Haven't heard from him since." He didn't sound particularly bothered by this. "Place gets quiet sometimes, but I don't mind." After breakfast, Fiona insisted on washing the dishes. Nate didn't argue, just headed outside to do his morning chores. She cleaned the kitchen area thoroughly, swept the floor, and was looking for something else to do when he came back in. "You don't have to do that," he said, seeing the spotless room. "I told you I pay my way. You're giving me shelter. The least I can do is help with the house." He considered this. "Fair enough, but you're a guest, not a servant. Don't feel obligated. It's not obligation, it's gratitude." She hung the dish towel to dry. "I should go into town today, try to find work." Nate's expression grew troubled. "Might be better to wait a day or two." "Let folks settle down." "Settle down from what? I just arrived." "Small towns talk, Fiona. By now, everyone knows a strange woman came through yesterday looking desperate. They've probably already decided your whole story." He leaned against the door frame. "If you go back today, they'll just dig in harder. But if you wait, let them get curious instead of suspicious, you might have better luck. I can't just hide here, not hiding, strategizing." He pulled on his work gloves. "Tell you what, I've got to ride out to the Fletcher Ranch today. They're expecting me. You could come along if you want, get out of the house. Mrs. Fletcher's a good woman. If she takes a shine to you, that'll carry weight in town." It was a good idea, and they both knew it. "What time are we leaving?" "About an hour. Wear something you don't mind getting dusty." Fiona changed into her sturdiest dress and braided her hair into a practical plait. When she came outside, she found Nate saddling a tall bay horse with patience and care. "This is Copper," he said, stroking the horse's neck. "He's got a good temperament, won't throw you." "I can ride," Fiona said, though it had been a while. "Figured you could, coming all the way from Philadelphia." He finished with the saddle and turned to face her. "But it's about 8 miles to the Fletcher place. You up for that? I walked 5 miles yesterday. I can manage 8 on horseback." He gave her a look that might have been approval or amusement. She couldn't quite tell. "Then let's go." Nate rode a dark roan mare named Sadie, and they set out at an easy pace that wouldn't tire the horses. The New Mexico landscape spread around them in rolling hills dotted with juniper and piñon pine, the mountains rising blue and distant to the north. The sky stretched vast and cloudless overhead, so blue it almost hurt to look at. They rode in silence for a while, and Fiona found it wasn't uncomfortable. Nate seemed like a man who didn't feel the need to fill quiet with chatter, and she appreciated that. She'd met too many men who talked just to hear themselves. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Go ahead." "Why didn't you even hesitate? Last night, I mean. You just let me in." Nate was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the horizon. My mother used to say that God puts people in your path for a reason. Sometimes you're the one who needs help, and sometimes you're the one who gives it. Either way, you don't question it, you just do what's right. He glanced at her. She was a better person than most, taught me that kindness costs nothing and means everything. She sounds wonderful, she was. He shifted in the saddle. What about your family? You said your father died. Last year, pneumonia. Fiona watched Copper's ears flick back and forth. He was a bookkeeper. Good with numbers, terrible with money. After he died, I found out he'd spent everything trying to save my mother when she was sick. She died anyway when I was 12. That's young to lose a mother. It is, but at least I had Pa for a while longer. We managed together. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. When he died, there was nothing left. The boarding house kept my things for the unpaid rent. I left Philadelphia with what I could carry and a promise from my aunt that I could come to Santa Fe. What happened to that promise? She sent a letter telling me not to come after all. Her husband doesn't want the burden of another mouth to feed. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. So I've been making my way west, working where I can, trying to earn enough to either settle somewhere or reach Santa Fe anyway and find my own place. That takes courage. It takes desperation. I didn't have much choice. There's always a choice, Nate said. You could have married someone you didn't love for security. You could have stayed in Philadelphia and worked yourself to death in a factory. Instead, you struck out on your own. That's not desperation, Fiona. That's strength. No one had ever put it that way before. Fiona felt something warm bloom in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. The Fletcher Ranch appeared on the horizon about 2 hours later, a sprawling operation with a large main house, several barns, and extensive corrals. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and Fiona could see workers moving around the property. A woman emerged from the house as they rode up, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked to be in her 40s, with graying blonde hair and a weathered but kind face. "Nathan Dalton," she called out. "Right on time as always. Mrs. Fletcher." Nate dismounted and helped Fiona down, his hands briefly on her waist. "This is Miss Fiona Riley. She's staying in Colfax for a spell." Mrs. Fletcher's sharp eyes took in Fiona's appearance, missing nothing. "Is that so? Well, any friend of Nate's is welcome here. Come inside. I've got lemonade made fresh this morning." The inside of the ranch house was large and comfortable, clearly the home of a successful operation. Mrs. Fletcher led them to a spacious kitchen and poured tall glasses of lemonade while Nate explained that he'd come to help with the fence, repairs Mr. Fletcher had mentioned last week. "He's out checking the north pasture, but he'll be back soon," Mrs. Fletcher said. "In the meantime, Miss Riley can keep me company. I'm about to start on my preserves, and I could use an extra pair of hands if you're willing." "I'd be happy to help," Fiona said. Nate excused himself to start on the fences, and Fiona found herself alone with Mrs. Fletcher, who immediately began setting out jars and fruit with the efficiency of long practice. "So you're staying in Colfax," Mrs. Fletcher said, her tone conversational but curious. "Where are you boarding?" Here it was, the moment of truth. Fiona could lie, but something told her that Mrs. Fletcher would see right through it. "I'm staying with Nate, actually. The town wouldn't rent me a room." Mrs. Fletcher's hands stilled on the jars. "I see. And why wouldn't they rent to you?" "I arrived looking like trouble, I suppose. My dress was bloodstained and I was traveling alone. No one wanted to take the risk. But Nate did. He didn't even question it, just opened his door." Fiona met the older woman's gaze directly. "I promise you, Mrs. Fletcher, I'm not trouble. The blood came from helping a woman who'd been injured in a stagecoach accident. I did what anyone would do, and I paid the price for it." Mrs. Fletcher studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you. And even if I didn't, I know Nathan Dalton. That boy wouldn't help someone who didn't deserve it. He's got his mother's heart. She handed Fiona a knife and a bowl of peaches. Start peeling these. We've got work to do. They worked side by side for the next few hours, and Fiona found herself relaxing into easy conversation. Mrs. Fletcher talked about the ranch, her 4 grown children who'd all moved away, and the challenges of maintaining such a large operation with just her husband and hired hands. Your Nate does good work, she said at one point. Always has. We'd hire him full-time if he wanted it, but he likes his independence. He's not my Nate, Fiona said quickly. Mrs. Fletcher gave her a knowing smile. If you say so, dear. When Mr. Fletcher returned, he proved to be as hospitable as his wife, insisting they stay for supper. The meal was hearty and plentiful, and the conversation flowed easily. Fiona noticed how comfortable Nate was here, joking with Mr. Fletcher about cattle prices and discussing the upcoming fall roundup. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Fletcher pulled Fiona aside. You come back anytime, you hear. And if you're looking for work, I could use help with the house a few days a week. The pay's fair and you'd be doing me a favor. Really? Fiona felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher. Thank me by showing up Monday morning, and dear, she lowered her voice. Don't let the town's narrow minds bother you. You've got good people in your corner now. The ride back to Nate's place felt different than the morning journey. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and Fiona felt lighter than she had in months. She had the promise of work, she'd met genuinely kind people, and she had a safe place to stay. Thank you for taking me along, she said as Nate's house came into view. Thank you for helping Mrs. Fletcher. She's been looking for someone she could trust. He glanced at her. You made a good impression. So did you, bringing me there. I didn't do anything special. You keep saying that, but it's not true. Fiona pulled Copper to a stop in front of the barn. You've done more for me in a day than most people would do for family. Nate dismounted and came to help her down. This time, when his hands circled her waist, they lingered a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and Fiona felt her breath catch. Maybe I had selfish reasons, he said quietly. Like what? Like enjoying your company. Like thinking the house feels less empty with you in it. He released her and stepped back, clearing his throat. I should tend the horses. Fiona went inside in a daze, her mind whirling. She'd been so focused on survival, on finding work and shelter, that she hadn't let herself think about Nathan Dalton as anything other than a generous stranger. But now, feeling the ghost of his hands on her waist, seeing the way he'd looked at her in the fading light, she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest. She prepared a simple supper from the supplies in the kitchen, and they ate together by lamplight. The conversation was easier now, comfortable in a way that usually took weeks to develop. They talked about everything and nothing, the best way to can peaches, the trouble with cattle in drought years, books they'd read, places they'd been. I've never left New Mexico, Nate admitted. Been to Santa Fe a few times, Albuquerque once, but mostly I stay around here. Don't you want to see more of the world? He shrugged. Maybe someday, but this is home. It's where my parents built their life, where they're buried. Doesn't feel right to leave it. That's loyalty. Or stubbornness. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. Over the next few days, they fell into a routine. Fiona would wake to find Nate already up, making coffee and tending to morning chores. They'd share breakfast, and then he'd head out to work while she cleaned the house and prepared supper. It was domestic in a way that should have felt strange but didn't. On Monday, Nate rode with her to the Fletcher ranch and left her there for her first day of work. Mrs. Fletcher put her to work immediately, and Fiona threw herself into the tasks with determination. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, helped with the cooking, and organized the pantry with the precision she'd learned from her dress shop days. "You're a treasure," Mrs. Fletcher declared at the end of the day. "I haven't seen this house this clean since my daughter lived here." Nate picked her up as the sun was setting, and they rode back together. Fiona found herself looking forward to this part of the day, the easy conversation as they traveled, the way Nate would point out wildlife or interesting rock formations. "You're good with her," he said one evening, referring to Copper. "Not everyone is. I used to ride in Philadelphia. There was a park where they rented horses." She stroked the bay's neck. "It was my favorite thing to do on Sunday afternoons. We could ride on Sundays," Nate offered. "I know some nice trails up in the hills. I'd like that." 2 weeks passed in this pleasant pattern. Fiona worked 3 days a week at the Fletcher Ranch, and on her days off, she took care of Nate's house, mended his clothes, and tried new recipes with the supplies he brought from town. He never made her feel like a servant or a burden, always treating her as an equal, asking her opinion on things, sharing his thoughts. She learned that he was 26, that his favorite meal was chicken and dumplings, that he'd once wanted to be a teacher but couldn't leave the ranch after his father died. He learned that she was 22, that she missed city life sometimes but was learning to love the open spaces, that she'd always wanted to learn to shoot but had never had the opportunity. "I can teach you," he said immediately. So on a Sunday afternoon, he set up tin cans on fence posts and showed her how to hold his rifle, how to aim, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger slowly. He stood close behind her, his arms bracketing hers, his breath warm on her neck as he guided her aim. "Like this," he murmured, and she felt the rumble of his voice through his chest where it pressed against her back. The rifle kicked when she fired, and she missed the can by a mile, but she didn't care. She was too aware of Nate's proximity, the solid warmth of him, the way his hands felt on her arms. "Try again," he said, and she did, over and over until she finally hit a can and they both cheered. She turned in his arms, flushed with victory, and found his face inches from hers. His eyes had gone dark, and she could see his pulse jumping in his throat. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Then Nate stepped back, clearing his throat. "You did good." The spell broke, but the awareness remained, humming between them like a current. That night, Fiona lay in bed unable to sleep, thinking about the feel of Nate's arms around her, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious. She'd been attracted to men before, had even been courted back in Philadelphia, but this felt different, deeper, more real. She heard him moving around in the main room, restless like she was, and wondered if he was thinking the same things. 3 weeks after Fiona had arrived in Colfax, Mrs. Fletcher invited them both to Sunday supper. The ranch house was full of noise and laughter, as the Fletcher's daughter and her family had come to visit. Fiona helped serve the meal and found herself drawn into the warm chaos of family life. After supper, the men went to look at a new bull while the women cleaned up. The daughter, Emma, was close to Fiona's age and had a friendly, open manner. "Ma says you're staying with Nate Dalton," Emma said, drying dishes. "That must be interesting." "He's been very kind," Fiona said carefully. "Nate's one of the good ones. Ma and Pa have known him since he was born." Emma lowered her voice. "Are you two courting?" "No, nothing like that. He's just helping me until I can get on my feet." Emma gave her a skeptical look. "If you say so, but I saw the way he looks at you." "How does he look at me?" "Like he's afraid you're going to disappear." Emma hung up the dish towel. "And you look at him the same way." Fiona opened her mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come, because Emma was right. She did look at Nate that way. She'd started to depend on him, not just for shelter but for companionship, for the way he made her laugh, for the steady presence that made her feel safe. Somewhere along the way, without meaning to, she'd started to fall in love with him. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt. She stood frozen at the wash basin, soapy water dripping from her hands, her heart pounding. "You okay?" Emma asked. "Yes, I need some air." Fiona stepped out onto the porch, gulping in the cool evening breeze. This complicated everything. She'd been planning to save enough money to reach Santa Fe, to build a life there. But now, the thought of leaving Colfax, leaving Nate, felt like tearing herself in half. She heard footsteps and turned to find Nate approaching from the barn area. He smiled when he saw her, that slow, warm smile that made her stomach flip. "You looked flushed in there," he said. "Everything all right, just hot from the kitchen." The lie came easily, but she hated it. He leaned against the porch railing beside her. "The Fletchers want us to come back for Thanksgiving. I said yes, but if you'd rather not, no, I'd love to." The words came out before she could think about them. Thanksgiving was months away. Was she planning to still be here in November? Good. He looked out at the darkening landscape. "I'm glad you came to Colfax, Fiona, even if it was an accident." "Me too," she whispered. They stood in comfortable silence, shoulders nearly touching, and Fiona felt the weight of unspoken words between them. She wanted to tell him how she felt, wanted to know if he felt the same way, but fear held her tongue. What if she was wrong? What if he was just being kind and she'd ruin everything by reading more into it? The ride home was quiet, both of them lost in thought. When they reached Nate's house, he helped her down from Copper, his hands lingering on her waist. "Fiona," he started, then seemed to lose his nerve. "Sleep well. You too." But neither of them slept well that night. Fiona knew because she heard Nate get up twice, heard him pacing, heard the door open and close as he stepped outside. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirl of emotions and questions. The next morning, there was a tension between them that hadn't been there before. They were too careful with each other, too polite, dancing around something neither wanted to name. It broke on a Thursday afternoon when Fiona was alone at the house, hanging laundry on the line Nate had strung up for her. She heard horse hooves and looked up to see 3 men riding toward the house. Something about the way they sat their horses, the way they looked at her, made her skin prickle with unease. "Afternoon," the lead rider said. He was middle-aged with a hard face and calculating eyes. "We're looking for Nathan Dalton. He's not here. When do you expect him back?" "I don't know." "Can I take a message?" The man's gaze raked over her in a way that made her feel dirty. "You must be the woman from town, the one with blood on her dress." Fiona lifted her chin. "I'm Fiona Riley, yes. Living here with Dalton, that's interesting." He exchanged looks with his companions. "You his woman?" "I'm staying here temporarily while I work for the Fletchers." "That's not what I asked." "That's all the answer you're getting." Fiona's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "If you want to leave a message for Mr. Dalton, do so. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave." The man's expression hardened. "I'm Tom Sanders, and I own half the land around here. You do well to remember that and show some respect." "I'll show respect when it's earned." Sanders' face flushed red. "You've got a mouth on you. Dalton know what kind of woman he's harboring. Mr. Sanders, I've asked you politely to leave. Don't make me ask again." "Or what? You'll do what exactly?" He started to dismount. That's when Fiona pulled the rifle from where she'd propped it inside the door, the one Nate had been teaching her to shoot with. She didn't point it at them, just held it in a way that showed she knew how to use it. "I'll defend myself and this property," she said calmly. "I'm sure Mr. Dalton would understand." Sanders stared at her for a long moment, then laughed. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that." He settled back in his saddle. "Tell Dalton that I came by. Tell him I'm still interested in buying his 40 acres. The offer's good until the end of the month." They rode off, and Fiona's hands started shaking the moment they were out of sight. She set the rifle down carefully and sank onto the porch steps, trying to catch her breath. That's how Nate found her 20 minutes later, sitting on the steps with her head in her hands. Fiona. He was off Sadie in an instant, kneeling in front of her. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine. Just shaken." She told him about Sanders and his men, about the veiled threats and the offer to buy the land. Nate's jaw tightened. "He had no right to come here, no right to speak to you that way. He said he owns half the land around here." "He owns a lot, yeah, and he wants more." Nate sat beside her on the steps. "He's been trying to buy my 40 acres for 2 years. Says he wants to expand his operation. I keep telling him no, and he keeps pushing." "Why does he want it so badly?" "There's a natural spring on the north corner, good water source. Without it, his cattle have to travel farther to drink." He shook his head. "It's not about the money for me, it's about keeping what my parents built." "I understand that." He looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Do you? Because I'm starting to think it's about more than just the land." "What do you mean?" "I mean that this house hasn't felt like just a house since you got here. It's felt like a home." He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "And I know you're planning to leave eventually, planning to go to Santa Fe, but the thought of you going makes me feel like I'm losing something I didn't even know I needed." Fiona's heart was racing. "Nate, I'm doing this backwards, I know. I should court you proper, take you to town socials, bring you flowers." He squeezed her hand. "But I'm not good with pretty words, Fiona. All I know is that I care about you, more than I've cared about anyone in a long time." "I care about you too," she whispered. "Enough to stay. Not just for a while, but for good." The question hung in the air between them. Fiona thought about Santa Fe, about the aunt who didn't want her, about the vague plans she'd made for a life she couldn't quite picture. Then she thought about waking up in this house every morning, sharing meals with Nate, working at the Fletcher Ranch, building something real and solid. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "You could never be a burden." "I don't want you to feel obligated," he cut her off by cupping her face in his hands. "Fiona Riley, you are the least obligated thing in my life. Everything I've done because I wanted to, because being around you makes me happier than I've been in years." "Really? Really?" His thumb stroked her cheek. "So what do you say? Will you stay?" Instead of answering with words, Fiona closed the distance between them and kissed him. It was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning the shape of this new thing between them. Then Nate's arms came around her, pulling her close, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like a promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nate rested his forehead against hers. "I'm taking that as a yes." "It's a yes," she confirmed and kissed him again. They sat on the porch steps as the sun set, wrapped in each other's arms, and Fiona felt a peace she hadn't known was possible. This hadn't been her plan. Colfax hadn't been her destination. But sometimes the best things in life were the ones you didn't plan for. "We should probably talk about the practical things," Nate said eventually. "Like marriage." Fiona pulled back to look at him. "Are you proposing?" "Not yet, not properly." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "But I will when I can do it right. Get you a ring, ask your permission proper. Until then, you can stay in the bedroom and I'll keep the main room. I won't have anyone saying we're doing things improper." "Nate, the whole town already thinks we're improper. Then we'll prove them wrong by doing this right." His expression was serious. "You deserve to be courted properly, Fiona. You deserve all the things I can give you, including respect." She loved him for that, for his stubborn honor in a world that often had none. "All right. We'll do it your way." "Our way," he corrected. "This is a partnership." Over the following weeks, Nate courted her with a determination that was both endearing and overwhelming. He brought her wildflowers picked from the hills, taught her to ride better, took her on picnics to beautiful spots on his land. He was affectionate but respectful, stealing kisses when they were alone but never pushing for more. Word spread through Colfax that Fiona Riley was staying with Nathan Dalton, and the town had opinions. Some people were scandalized. Others were cautiously approving, especially after Mrs. Fletcher made it known that she thought highly of the girl. The hotel keeper and the boarding house owner remained cold, but Fiona found she didn't care. She had work she enjoyed, a home that felt real, and a man who loved her. What did she need with the town's approval? One Saturday in October, Nate took her into Colfax to the general store. She felt the stares as they walked down Main Street, heard the whispers, but Nate kept her hand tucked in the crook of his elbow, his head high. Inside the store, the owner's wife helped them with cool politeness until Nate made it clear he was buying Fiona a new dress, a good one, the kind a man bought for his intended. After that, the woman's attitude shifted slightly, becoming more curious than hostile. "Are congratulations in order?" she asked carefully. "Not yet," Nate said, "but soon." That evening he took Fiona to a spot on his property where the land rose in a small hill, giving a view of the surrounding valley. The sunset painted everything gold and crimson, and in the distance they could see the mountains purple with shadow. "This is where I want to build," Nate said, his arm around her waist. "A bigger house when we need it, with a porch that wraps around so you can sit and watch the sunsets." "You've been planning this." "I've been dreaming about it." He turned her to face him, "Dreaming about a future that has you in it." He dropped to one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold ring with a small but perfect sapphire. "Fiona Riley, I know we haven't known each other long. I know this isn't how you planned your life to go, but I love you and I want to spend every day proving that you made the right choice by staying." He took the ring from the box. "Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he stood and kissed her, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath. They decided on a November wedding, giving them time to prepare, but not so long that waiting felt unbearable. Mrs. Fletcher insisted on hosting the reception at the ranch, and Emma came back from her home in Albuquerque to help with the preparations. The town's attitude shifted once the engagement was official. It was one thing to harbor a scandalous woman, another entirely to marry one. Nate's clear devotion and Fiona's obvious respectability wore down even the hardest hearts. The minister agreed to perform the ceremony, and the hotel keeper's wife actually smiled at Fiona when she came into the general store. "I may have judged you too harshly," she admitted stiffly. "Nathan Dalton is a good man. He wouldn't choose poorly." It wasn't much of an apology, but Fiona accepted it graciously. Tom Sanders came by the property one more time, a week before the wedding. This time Nate was home, and Fiona watched from the porch as the two men talked in the yard. "I'll give you 10% more than my last offer," Sanders said. "That's more than fair. I told you the land's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Dalton, especially now that you've got a woman to provide for. You'll need money for a wife, maybe children. My offer could set you up nice." "We'll manage just fine." Nate's voice was hard. "The land stays in my family." Sanders shook his head. "You're making a mistake. That spring is valuable." "Then I guess I'm a rich man." Nate crossed his arms. "We're done here, Sanders." The older man looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Nate's expression stopped him. He rode off in a cloud of dust, and Nate returned to the porch. "Is he going to be trouble?" Fiona asked. "Probably, but we'll handle it together." He pulled her close. "You and me against whatever comes." "You and me," she echoed and kissed him. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, perfect November weather. Fiona dressed in the simple white dress she'd sewn with help from Emma and Mrs. Fletcher, her hair pinned up with flowers. She had no family to attend, but it didn't matter. The Fletchers had become her family, along with a handful of people from town who'd warmed to her. The ceremony was short and sweet, held in the small church with sunlight streaming through the windows. Nate wore his best suit, his hair freshly cut, and when he saw Fiona walking down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, and Fiona barely heard the rest. She was too focused on Nate, on the way he held her hands like she was precious, on the vows he spoke in a voice thick with emotion. When it was her turn, she promised to love him, to stand by him, to build a life together in this wild land. "I now pronounce you man and wife." Their kiss was chaste, appropriate for a church, but it held the promise of more. They walked out into the afternoon sunshine as husband and wife, and Fiona felt like her heart might burst with happiness. The reception at the Fletcher Ranch was lively and warm. There was food and music, dancing and laughter. Fiona danced with Nate, with Mr. Fletcher, even with some of the men from town who decided she was acceptable now that she had a ring on her finger. As the sun set, Nate pulled her away from the party, leading her to where their horses were tied. "Where are we going?" she asked, laughing. "Home, Mrs. Dalton." He boosted her onto Copper and mounted Sadie. "I want to start our married life in our own place." They rode through the gathering dusk, and when Nate's house came into view, Fiona saw that he'd hung lanterns on the porch, making it glow like a beacon. He helped her down and swept her into his arms, carrying her over the threshold. "Welcome home, wife." "I've been living here for months," she pointed out, but she was smiling. That was different. Now it's official. He set her down gently and cupped her face. "Now it's forever." They made love that night for the first time, a sweet and awkward and beautiful joining that left them both breathless and laughing. Afterwards, they lay tangled in the sheets, Fiona's head on Nate's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too." He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for taking a chance on a stranger who opened his door. Thank you for opening it." Winter came to New Mexico with cold winds and occasional snow. Fiona settled into married life with surprising ease. She continued working for the Fletchers 2 days a week, and the rest of the time she worked on making the small house into a real home. She sewed curtains and quilts, planted a winter vegetable garden, learned to cook the foods Nate loved. For Christmas, she gave him a new hat that she'd bought with her earnings. He gave her a beautiful leather-bound journal and a set of pens, having noticed her love of writing. "For recording our life," he said, "so we never forget how this all started." She started that very night, writing about the day she'd arrived in Colfax desperate and alone, about the cowboy who'd taken her in without question, about falling in love in the most unexpected way. January brought deep cold and the news that Fiona was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't been sure until Mrs. Fletcher confirmed it with the knowing eye of a woman who'd borne 4 children. "You're going to be a mother," she said, squeezing Fiona's hands. Fiona rode home in a daze and found Nate in the barn, mending tack. He took one look at her face and stood immediately. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right." She took his hands and placed them on her still flat stomach. "We're having a baby." The smile that split his face was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, then set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he breathed. "We're having a baby. Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't cover it." He kissed her thoroughly. "I'm over the moon." They spent the rest of the winter preparing for the baby, turning a corner of the main room into a nursery area. Nate built a cradle with the same careful craftsmanship he brought to all his work, and Fiona sewed tiny clothes, still amazed that soon there would be a child to wear them. In March, Tom Sanders made one final attempt to buy the land. This time he brought papers, official-looking documents that claimed there was a dispute over the property boundaries. "According to this survey, your spring is actually on my land," Sanders said, pointing to the map. Nate studied the papers, his expression hard. "This is a fake. My father had the land surveyed properly when he bought it. Can you prove that?" "As a matter of fact, I can." Nate went into the house and returned with a strongbox. Inside were the original deed and survey, clearly showing that the spring was well within his property lines. Sanders' face flushed. "Those could be forgeries." "They're not, and you know it." Nate's voice was dangerously quiet. "I've been patient with you, Sanders. I've turned down your offers politely. But if you come onto my land one more time with false claims and threats, I'll take this to the territorial judge. I doubt he'll appreciate someone trying to steal property through fraud." Sanders looked like he wanted to argue, but he could see he was beaten. "You'll regret this, Dalton." "I regret nothing about my life." Nate put his arm around Fiona, his hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. "Now get off my property and don't come back." Sanders left, and Fiona released the breath she'd been holding. "Is it over?" "It's over. He knows he can't win legally, and he's not stupid enough to try anything illegal." Nate kissed her forehead. "We're safe." As spring turned to summer, Fiona's belly grew round and full. She had to stop working at the Fletcher Ranch in her 7th month, but Mrs. Fletcher came to visit often, bringing food and advice. "The first one's always the hardest," she said cheerfully. "But you're strong. You'll do fine." Fiona hoped she was right. The baby came on a hot day in August, almost exactly a year after Fiona had first arrived in Colfax. The labor was long and hard, attended by Mrs. Fletcher and an older woman from town who served as midwife. Nate paced outside for hours, until finally the thin cry of a newborn split the air. Mrs. Fletcher emerged with a smile. "You have a son. Both mother and baby are doing well." Nate practically flew into the bedroom. Fiona lay exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Meet our son." Nate sat carefully on the edge of the bed, staring at the tiny face with wonder. The baby had dark hair and was red-faced from crying, but to Nate he was perfect. "He's beautiful," Nate whispered. "We should name him." Fiona stroked the baby's soft head. "What was your father's name?" "John, but we don't have to. John Dalton." Fiona smiled. "It's perfect." They called him Jack from the start, and he became the center of their world. Nate proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with the baby at night, making silly faces to earn those first precious smiles. Watching him with their son, Fiona fell in love with him all over again. Jack was 6 months old when they learned another baby was on the way. Fiona laughed when Mrs. Fletcher confirmed her suspicion. "Irish twins," the older woman said. "You'll have your hands full." "We'll manage," Fiona said, and she believed it. Their daughter arrived the following summer, an easier birth than the first. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's green eyes, and they named her Rose after Nate's mother. With 2 babies under 2, life became a whirlwind of feeding and changing and sleepless nights. But there was also laughter and love, first steps and first words, the sweet chaos of a growing family. On a cool evening in September, when Jack was running around the yard and Rose was learning to crawl, Nate and Fiona sat on the porch watching them. "Do you ever miss Philadelphia?" Nate asked. Fiona thought about it, really thought about it. "Sometimes I miss things about it. The shops, the libraries, the theater. but I don't miss the life I had there. That girl who arrived here desperate and alone feels like a different person." "She was brave," Nate said. "Coming all this way, not giving up even when things got hard." "She was desperate," Fiona corrected. "But she got lucky. A cowboy opened his door without question and changed everything." "I'm the lucky one." He pulled her close. "You gave me a family. You made this house a home. You gave me a reason to build something bigger than just myself. We built it together." "Together," he agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play as the sun set over the New Mexico landscape. In the distance, they could see the framework of the new house going up on the hill where Nate had proposed. It would be finished by winter, a bigger home for their growing family, with the wraparound porch he'd promised. True to his word, Tom Sanders had never returned. They'd heard he'd sold out to a larger ranch operation and moved to Texas. Without his interference, Nate's small spread had thrived. The cattle brought in steady money, and between that and Fiona's occasional work for the Fletchers, they were more than comfortable. But it wasn't the financial security that made Fiona happy. It was the life they'd built, the love they'd found, the family they were raising. Jack came running up to the porch, his chubby legs pumping. "Papa, up!" Nate scooped him up, tossing him in the air and catching him, earning delighted squeals. Fiona fetched Rose from her blanket on the ground, and they all sat together on the porch steps as the stars began to emerge. "Tell story," Jack demanded. "Which story?" Nate asked. "Mama's story." It had become Jack's favorite bedtime story, the tale of how his parents met. Nate launched into it, embellishing as he always did, making Fiona laugh. Once upon a time, there was a brave woman who came to a town that didn't understand her. She knocked on doors, but they all stayed closed, until she found a small house where a cowboy lived. Fiona listened to her husband's warm voice telling their story to their son, and felt a contentment so deep, it was almost painful. She thought about that desperate woman who'd arrived in Colfax 2 years ago, blood-stained and alone, and silently thanked her for being brave enough to knock on one more door. That knock had led to everything. To love, to family, to a home that felt like it had been waiting for her all along. The years passed in the way they do when you're living a good life, quickly but rich with meaning. The new house was completed and they moved in just before the first snow. It was everything Nate had promised, spacious and solid, built to last generations. Jack grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved helping his father with the cattle. Rose was more outgoing, chattering constantly and making friends with everyone she met. 2 more children followed. Samuel, who arrived when Jack was 5, and little Margaret, who completed their family when Fiona was 30. 4 children felt like plenty, and they filled the big house with noise and laughter and the sweet chaos of family life. Fiona continued to write in her journal, recording the everyday moments that made up their life. Jack's first day of school, Rose learning to ride, Samuel's endless questions about everything, Margaret's infectious giggle. She wrote about the hard times too, the drought year when they worried about the cattle, the winter when scarlet fever swept through Colfax and they barely slept for fear of losing the children. But they'd weathered everything together, Nate and Fiona, partners in every sense of the word. The town that had once refused her shelter became her home. She served on the school board, helped organize church socials, and became known as one of the most reliable women in Colfax. The hotel keeper who turned her away eventually apologized, years later, admitting he'd been wrong. "You turned out to be one of our finest citizens," he said, and Fiona accepted the apology with grace. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Nate took her back to the spot where he'd proposed. The children were spending the night at the Fletcher ranch, giving them a rare evening alone. 10 years, Nate said, pulling her close. Feels like both forever and no time at all. I know exactly what you mean. Fiona leaned into him. Do you ever regret it, taking in a strange woman with blood on her dress? Not for 1 second. He tilted her face up to kiss her. Best decision I ever made was opening that door. Second best, she corrected. What was the first? Asking me to marry you. He laughed and kissed her again. They stood watching the sunset, just as they had a decade ago, but now their love was deeper, tested by time and trial and found unbreakable. More years passed. The children grew and started their own lives. Jack married a girl from town and took over running the cattle operation. Rose shocked everyone by becoming a teacher, bright and beloved by her students. Samuel left for college in the East, but he wrote often and came home for holidays. Margaret, the baby, showed signs of becoming a skilled horsewoman, often riding out with her father to check the herd. Fiona and Nate grew older together, silver threading through their hair, lines deepening around their eyes. But their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, seasoned by decades of choosing each other every single day. On a warm spring evening when they were in their 50s, they sat on the wraparound porch of the house Nate had built for them. Their grandchildren, Jack's twins, played in the yard while the sunset painted everything gold. You remember the first night I stayed here? Fiona asked, her hand in Nate's. When you gave me your bed and slept on the floor. I remember everything about that night. He squeezed her hand. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, even exhausted and covered in dust. I thought you were crazy helping a stranger like that. Maybe I was, crazy in love even then. He pulled her closer. I looked at you and knew my life was about to change. And did it change for the better? Instead of answering, Nate kissed her, long and sweet and full of decades of love. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. Fiona Dalton, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to build something lasting. Every single day with you has been a gift. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I love you so much. I love you too. Always have, always will. They sat together as the stars emerged, surrounded by the life they'd built, the family they'd created, the love they'd nurtured through the years. In the distance, they could see Jack and his wife at the old house, now refurbished and lived in by the next generation. The land would stay in the family, just as Nate had always wanted. Rose was teaching at the Colfax school, shaping young minds with patience and dedication. Samuel had returned from college and opened a law practice in Santa Fe but visited often. Margaret, still unmarried at 22, showed no signs of settling down, more interested in running the ranch than finding a husband. Give her time, Fiona always said when people asked. She'll find her way. Just as Fiona had found her own way, all those years ago when a town refused her shelter and one cowboy opened his door without question. As they aged, Nate and Fiona became the heart of their community. They were the couple people pointed to when they talked about true love, about building a life together, about weathering storms and coming out stronger. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the whole town came out to celebrate. There was a party at the Fletcher Ranch, just like their wedding reception had been, though Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher were long gone. Their children ran the operation now, and they'd insisted on hosting. Fiona wore a new dress in deep blue, and Nate wore his best suit, both of them still trying to impress each other after half a century. They danced together as the sun set, and Fiona thought about the journey that had brought them here. From Philadelphia to New Mexico territory, from desperate and alone to loved and surrounded by family, from a woman with blood on her dress to a respected matriarch of a thriving clan. It had been a long, winding road, but she wouldn't change a single step. "What are you thinking about?" Nate asked, spinning her gently. "How lucky I am. How grateful. The luck was all mine." She smiled up at him, this man who'd taken her in without question, who'd loved her without reservation, who'd built a life with her that exceeded anything she could have imagined. "No," she said softly. "It was ours. We were lucky together." And as they danced under the New Mexico stars, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends, Fiona knew with absolute certainty that her luck had begun the day she knocked on a cowboy's door and he opened it wide, letting her into his home and, eventually, his heart. The town had refused her shelter, but one cowboy had opened his door without question, and in doing so had given her everything she'd ever needed. A home, a family, and a love that would last all the days of her life. Years later, when they were both old and silver-haired, sitting on that same porch watching yet another generation of Daltons run and play, Nate would ask her if she had any regrets. "Only one," she'd say with a smile. "I regret that I didn't knock on your door first, so I could have had even more years with you." And he would kiss her, as he'd done thousands of times before, and tell her that the years they'd had were more than enough. They were perfect. They were everything. Because that's what happened when you opened your door to someone in need, when you led with kindness instead of judgment, when you chose love over fear. You got a lifetime of moments like this, of sitting beside the person you loved most in the world, watching the sun set on a life well lived. The town of Colfax had refused Fiona Riley shelter on a hot August day in 1878. But Nathan Dalton had opened his door without question, and that single act of kindness had rippled out through the years, creating a family, a legacy, a love story that would be told and retold for generations. And as Fiona sat on her porch in the golden light of evening, her hand in her husband's, surrounded by the proof of a life fully lived and deeply loved, she knew that sometimes the best things in life came from the moments when you were most desperate, most lost, most in need of grace. Because that's when doors opened. That's when cowboys with kind hearts and strong hands stepped forward. That's when love found a way, against all odds, to bloom in the wild and beautiful landscape of the New Mexico territory, growing strong and true and lasting all the way to the very end.